Please be seated. Can you hear me from here? Thank you all for coming. I'm Jonathan Hand, in case you're curious. This lecture is about Hegel. I'd like to thank last year's members of last year's study group on Hegel, faculty study group on Hegel, the brave and stalwart members who read the Phenomenology almost all the way through with me last year. Judith Adam, Mike Ermintrout, David Levy, and Rayoni Padui. There was a handout. I guess they only made 80 copies. I'm sorry about that. But Hegel is so clear you won't really need it. What the handout has, and you should, if you can, try to sit next to someone who has one. There are two parts of the handout, for those of you who do have it. There are the quotes I'm going to read by paragraph number, and then there's the table of contents, which is nice to refer to so you can get a sense of the whole. I'm going to be focusing my attention on chapter 5, reason, but it's nice to see where that fits in, and I will say a little bit about where that fits into the rest of the book. This should take about 1 hour and 10 minutes, for which I ask your indulgence. Hegel is famous, or rather infamous, as a Luftmensch, one of those who dwell high above, and some might say disconnected from the earth, from things solid, concrete, and specific. Therefore, as your flight attendant, I wish to inform you that the exits are clearly marked. One in the rear, one in the front. If we experience a drop in cabin pressure due to a complete lack of intelligibility, oxygen masks will drop from the ceiling. Please put on your own mask before helping your children. I'm going to begin gently by reminding you of things that are familiar. In Plato's Republic, Socrates gives his famous image of the cave as, quote, an image of our nature in its education and want of education. Nature, physis, is a word that Plato does not use carelessly. We might well ask, is this image still apt? Is it true that most human beings are by nature, that is to say, everywhere and always, except for a lucky few whose souls are turned around and let out of the cave, subject to bonds and folly? Maybe the cave of public opinion can be changed, progressively more enlightened. Such, certainly, was the hope of those philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, Bacon, Hobbes, Locke, Descartes, and Montesquieu, to name a few, upon whose projects our political regime, liberal democracy, and our regime of knowledge, modern science, are based. Even if, or maybe precisely because, science doesn't have, or even claim to pursue, absolute truth about nature, isn't science always coming up with and disseminating to the public better and better models of the world? As far as society is concerned, and our relations with each other, aren't we now in the process of, if not yet entirely successful at, throwing off the hateful prejudice of the past that stand in the way of the individual's self-defined pursuit of happiness, such as, to use the terms of today's unholy trinity, racism, sexism, and homophobia? Or are we moderns, inhabitants of the West, perhaps only in a different kind of cave, a cave beneath the cave, as one famous 20th century student of Plato's put it? In 1931, Leo Strauss, now I have your attention, wrote the following: bearing in mind the classical representation of the natural difficulties involved in philosophizing, in other words, the Platonic figure of the cave, one can say that today we are in a second, much deeper cave than the fortunate, ignorant persons with whom Socrates was concerned. We need history, first of all, in order to climb up into the cave from which Socrates can lead us to the light. We need a propedeutic, something the Greeks did not need, namely book learning. As is pointed out in Stephen Smith's noteworthy recent book on Strauss, from which I take this quote, the image of modernity as a second cave, a deepening of the educational problem created paradoxically by the transformative effect of modern philosophy on the world, is central to Strauss's thought. 15 years later, in Persecution and the Art of Writing, Strauss returns to the same metaphor. This is a quote, if one of Plato's descendants desired to ascend to the light of the sun, he would first have to try to reach the level of the natural cave, and he would have to invent new and most artificial tools unknown and unnecessary to those who dwelt in the natural cave, unquote. The image of a second cave, and of our thus now needing to ascend first to a natural cave, whatever that might be, is provocative and is, as far as I know, original to Strauss. However, Strauss was hardly the first to see the phenomenon, in other words, the modern educational problem to which the image refers. That problem can be stated as a question. In our time, for education, what is the one thing most needful? An ever more complete fulfillment of the project of enlightenment, namely the dissemination of the results of natural science, an ever-increasing secularism, and a continuing deconstruction of all obstacles to the freedom, meaning autonomy or self-definition of human beings, or a reconsideration of pre-modern thought in order to illuminate those aspects of a full humanity, meaning primarily an awareness of the full or natural range of human questions, an awareness somehow put at risk by the modern Western condition? This question, it seems to me, lies at the center of Hegel's thought. So, given the alternatives I have just stated, what is Hegel's answer? Not surprisingly, at least not surprising to those who know him, both. On the one hand, it appears that Hegel is in partial agreement with his pupil. How good a pupil is a question for discussion, Marx. Namely, Marx's dictum that, quote, to be radical is to grasp things by the root, and for man, the root is man himself, unquote. What could be more modern than that? For Hegel, the philosophical kernel of truth in the Christian symbol of God becoming man is that the human spirit, as it evolves through time, becomes divine just as much as the divine becomes human. It must be noted that Hegel's is a divinity understood more in Aristotle's terms, thought thinking itself, rather than in the biblical terms of particular providence and individual carnal salvation. Hegel, in all his thought, tried to fulfill the Enlightenment project, and not just in his thought. In his youth, while a student in the Tübingen Theological Seminary, Hegel was a supporter of the French Revolution and claimed to remain, if in a more nuanced way, a supporter into his mature years. For some reason, he continued to see that revolution, despite the horrors of the Reign of Terror, as a necessary event for the further progress of society and of thinking, including his own thinking. On the other hand, and with Hegel there is always another hand. That's why I like him. In the Phenomenology, Hegel critiques the modern revolutionary mentality in the strongest possible terms, tracing a direct line of descent from the Enlightenment to the Reign of Terror. In the section of the Phenomenology entitled, appropriately enough, Absolute Freedom and Terror, Hegel shows in effect that from the modern philosophy of the likes of Descartes, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Voltaire, there is a slippery slope to Robespierre and the guillotine. You'll note in your table of contents, it comes right after the section on the Enlightenment. The French Revolution produced a slaughter different in kind from any the world had seen, a slaughter unknown in antiquity, namely political murder in the name of reason and progress, in the name of philosophy. Starting in September 1793 and continuing until July 1794, heads were lopped off by the thousands, quote, like cabbages, unquote, Hegel says, in an attempt to root out all enemies of the revolution, all obstacles to progress. Writing only a few years later, in 1807, Hegel argues that this apparently senseless slaughter appeared for a reason. It was an attempt to satisfy the demands of the modern self. The modern self, that is, the self whose self-conception is based on the principles of universal freedom and equality, is, above all, an abstract self. Such a self has no tolerance for distinction or inequality. Such a self insists on defining itself, on accepting no content given to it by nature or history. It is thus always an ideal to be achieved in the future, an ideal always in the distance, because in fact, incompatible with actual concrete selves, which are necessarily given content by their historical context, by their specific role in society, and their natural basis in the consciousness of an actual living human being. Any actual society which exists, as Plato would put it, indeed, as opposed to being merely a society in speech, in other words, an ideal project of the Republic, has distinctions, definitions, and inequalities. This necessary incompatibility between the revolutionary ideal and reality resulted in, Hegel argues, a, quote, theory of destruction, unquote. So, if Hegel remained to the end of his days a supporter of the principles of 1789, if he remained, in short, a modern, he is a modern of a most peculiar kind. What then is Hegel's stance towards the Enlightenment? Well, the Enlightenment must be both fulfilled and overcome. In short, the Enlightenment must be aufgehoben, and those of you who know German will excuse my horrible pronunciation. The past participle of the verb aufheben. This is Hegel's favorite verb. Any reader of footnotes to Hegel translations soon encounters it, and among its meanings in ordinary speech are to lift up, to cancel, to preserve, and to supersede. Great. For Hegel, how is this Aufhebung, this raising, canceling, preserving, superseding of the Enlightenment accomplished? In practice, in the person of Napoleon, whom Hegel calls the world spirit on horseback, who is part of the group that stops the reign of terror, but at the same time, while ending the Republic, also instantiates the principles of liberty and equality in the law, in the Code Napoleon. Philosophically, however, Hegel accomplishes the overcoming of the Enlightenment in the chapter of the Phenomenology called Reason, Vernunft, a chapter which constitutes Hegel's immanent critique, that is, a critique from within, of the self-understanding, or rather the various self-understandings that constitute that moment in place and time known as the Enlightenment. The Reason chapter, chapter 5, ends with a transition to that fuller form of subjectivity Hegel calls spirit, Geist. Despite the name, there is nothing ghostly about Geist. Let's clear up a common misunderstanding. Very much unlike reason, which asserts its timelessness and universality, spirit is human thought understood as social and historical, as embodied and in time all the way down. Hegel uses the term spirit as it is used in Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, or as we might use it now as culture. Now in our time, we frequently say, unthinkingly, that, quote, all thought is relative to its time, unquote. Hegelians, without having read Hegel, we do not see, as Hegel does, that thought, because it is a claim about all thought, cannot, if true, itself be a relative thought. The Phenomenology of Spirit is Hegel's philosophical demonstration of the connection between thought and time. It is spirit gradually coming to the knowledge, to both the certainty and the truth, that it is spirit, a knowledge Hegel calls absolute knowing. Wow. The Phenomenology has often been described as a Bildungsroman, a novel of education, wherein a character I'll call Mr. or Ms. Consciousness learns through experience, which for Hegel means reflection on its own thought. It's this very strange use of the word experience. The story starts with consciousness as pure sensuous immediacy and proceeds through 8 chapters, through 8 progressively more reflective and concrete ways of knowing. So if you look at your table of contents, you'll see that there are lettered headings, but there are also Roman numerals 1 through 8. And those are the 8 stages of Spirit's odyssey on its way to knowing itself. Within that movement of the Phenomenology, the movement of the Reason chapter, chapter 5, looks to me very much like an ascent to a natural cave. In other words, the Greek world described as the first section of the next chapter, chapter 6, a world Hegel entitles True Spirit. The critique of the Enlightenment in the Reason chapter, and this is what's a little complicated, chapter 5 is thus of a very different order than the global critique of the Enlightenment in the Spirit chapter, chapter 6. The latter shows how the Enlightenment as a whole, in its first incarnation as Spirit, as an actual historical world, imploded through a demand for absolute freedom in the Reign of Terror. By contrast, the critique of chapter 5 does not proceed chronologically or on the level of society as a whole. It proceeds by thinking through the claims of various forms of modern selves on their own terms. Hegel starts with the scientist and goes through romantics and pleasure seekers, leaders of moral reform, rebels who live on the fringes of society, Machiavellian pragmatists, and intellectuals. Each one of these forms of life, or type of soul, is shown to fail on its own terms its understanding of the world and of itself is self-contradictory. One could call such a procedure Socratic, or as Hegel calls it, dialectical. Many of the characters of chapter 5, if you could call them that, do not seem terribly reasonable. What are they all doing in chapter 5? Well, all of these forms of self have one thing in common, which puts them, including, strangely, a self like Goethe's Faust, all in this chapter. They claim to derive their criteria of the true, the just, and the good ahistorically from their own thinking. Thus, they fail to see what Hegel sees as the essential truth about thought and the self, that thinking subjectivity is, as spirit, quote, an I that is a we that is an I. And Hegel repeats this formula in several places. One could say that the we part in that formula is the cave that is natural to humans. In Hegel's presentation, spirit moves beyond all individualistic perspectives, and yet Hegel catalogs these perspectives so exhaustively because, I suspect, for Hegel, such perspectives will be a permanent feature of the modern landscape. The characters of the people of the Reason chapter are all abstract selves in the literal sense, that they all leave out, have something taken away, abstracted in their understanding of the world and themselves. And this is why these modern selves come in so many shapes and sizes. Their common defect comes despite, or perhaps because, of the fact that they are all selves. Selves that claim, in a way, say that Creon and Antigone do not, that they are most fundamentally selves, individuals. One should note here that Antigone, who appears in the next chapter, chapter 6, appeals to divine law that everybody knows, not to her conscience or individual conviction. Such a self, the self-proclaimed individual, first arose, Hegel suggests at the beginning of the Reason chapter, in Europe around the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. For Hegel, Martin Luther's "Here I stand, I cannot do other," and Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," are very much of the same epoch. Understanding the Reason chapter as an ascent to the natural cave helps to explain something which might appear strange, namely that a book that purports to demonstrate not just the historicity but the progression of human thought, that thought not just moves in time but becomes fuller in time, treats the various forms of modern thought before it treats the Greek world. In the remainder of our time together, I want to do three things. To look at the first modern character who appears in the Reason section, the natural scientist. To sketch how reason grows dialectically into spirit. And three, to say just a few words about why Hegel uses the Greek world as an example of true spirit, and not, say, ancient Egypt, Persia, Israel, India, or China. It's a huge question. I can only say a few words. I will conclude with a few brief remarks about why all of this matters. In other words, why it matters to us now, to Americans living in the 21st century. So, first section, modern natural science. Hegel says several times in the beginning of the Reason chapter that reason is the certainty, the Gewissheit of being all reality. Certainty, however, is not the same thing as truth. Reason, in the same way as all the other shapes of consciousness described in the Phenomenology, is inherently driven to prove that its particular form of certainty, that there is nothing absolute other than reason, is justified. Thus, Hegel says, paragraph 239, and here you can look at the handout, as merely the certainty of being all reality, it, reason, is aware within this concept that as certainty, as the I, it is not yet reality and truth. And it is thus driven to elevate its certainty into truth and to bring to fruition that empty mind. The sequence of the various ways that the self tries to do this and the various constructive failures it has along the way, the experience by which it learns, form the storyline of chapter 5. For obvious reasons, the chapter is nearly 200 closely argued pages. I can touch on only a few of the high spots. Looking at the table of contents, we see that the first major section of the chapter, Hegel calls observing reason. And the first major part of that section, observing nature. So in other words, that's Roman numeral 5, big A, little a. Hegel, in trying to get a critical perspective on the Enlightenment, goes immediately for the citadel, the most heavily fortified position, the very center of the Enlightenment self-confidence, science, and in particular natural science. Whatever doubts we might have about the modern age, we always say, well, those people in the bad old days didn't know the earth moved. They didn't know about the chemical elements, or electricity, or a lot of other things. One must avoid misunderstandings. Despite what some allege, Hegel is most definitely not trying to refute science or place it within some straitjacket made up of preconceived ideas. I think he stays close to scientific practice, actually. Rather, he is engaged in a critique of science in the Kantian sense of critique, to set out the limits so as to see the shape or nature of something. The Greek origin of critique is the verb kreneo, which means both to cut and to judge, such as when one has discriminating taste. However, unlike Kant, Hegel is not engaged in building a theory of knowledge, a clear distinction or discrimination of what we can know from what we can't. Rather, the central question for Hegel is one of motive. Do the scientists understand why they do what they do and what they're in fact looking for? We readers of the Phenomenology have known, since going beyond the consciousness section, that's the first 3 chapters, that human subjects are not and cannot be conceived of as disembodied minds. Hence, as a living consciousness, man does not want mere knowledge, but satisfaction. What would satisfy these men of science? The term that Hegel uses for reason understood as science, observing reason, beobachtende Vernunft, is revealing. The related verb, beobachten, means to see, notice, observe, watch. Thus, for example, to be under police surveillance is to be von der Polizei beobachtet. Observation connotes that cool detachment that gives a certain superiority, especially if one observes without being seen. The term's ordinary sense of watching reminds one of the etymology of theory from the Greek verb theao, to see, also the root of the word theater. Now, it is just this coolness, the calm self-possession and self-awareness of the detached observer that is at stake. Just before the beginning of the observing reason section, Hegel says that reason, in trying to raise its certainty of being all reality to truth, remains a restless or disquieted seeking, ein unruhiges Suchen. Just a few paragraphs later, near the beginning of the observing nature section, paragraph 245, Hegel refers to observing reason's, quote, restless, disquieted instinct, rastlosen unruhigen Instinkte. The last term, instinct, which Hegel repeats several times, is almost a slap in the face to the self-proclaimed observer. In other words, the man claiming calm self-awareness. For isn't reason supposed to raise us above instinct, to be human as opposed to being animal? As we shall see, the residual, unreflective instinctiveness of the scientist is going to come back at the end of chapter 5 in a section humorously called, quote, the spiritual animal kingdom, unquote, which is Hegel's treatment of the modern type now known as intellectuals. Lest any take umbrage, perhaps I should remind you, the shapes of consciousness in the phenomenology are not real people in all their complexity and individuality. They are ideal types, alternative positions, or types of self. So the pure man of woman or woman of science, Mr./Ms. observer, seems to be in the grip of something he or she does not understand, an instinct that can find no satisfaction, no peace. Whence the problem? Well, reason inherently tries to raise its certainty to truth. That is, it tries to show that it is all reality. In other words, to find itself in the world. But it can't, not at this stage in its development. Here, Hegel is uncharacteristically eloquent. That's paragraph 241 in the handout. But if reason rummages around through all the innards of things and opens up all their veins so that reason might encounter itself gushing out from them, then it will have no luck or happiness. Rather, it must have at an earlier point perfected itself in order to be able to experience its perfection. Later, much later in the book, reason as perfected, that is, as coming to the knowledge of itself as spirit, will achieve satisfaction because it will experience its own motion in the logic of world history, the logic of its own progressive embodiment and self-awareness. Why can't observing reason find any such happiness? Well, it can't come up with a coherent self-understanding and thus engages in a certain equivocation. Observing reason is by its very nature. An example is the antinomy of Hume and Kant, torn between empiricism and idealism. So it shuttles back and forth between two self-interpretations. On the one hand, it is a point of pride of modern science that it is far more empirical than, say, Aristotle's science. The reality, however, as Hegel points out, is messier. This is section 244 in the handout. However much the unthinking consciousness speaks of observation and experience as the source of truth, still its words make it sound as if the whole business were merely a matter of tasting, smelling, feeling, hearing, and seeing. But in the enthusiasm with which it recommends tasting, smelling, etc., it forgets to say that it also, in fact, has no less essentially already determined the object of this sensation, and that in its eyes this determination counts for it at least as much as that sensation. It will also, without further ado, admit that it is in general not that much concerned with perceiving, and that, for example, the perception that the penknife lies next to this tobacco box will not count for it as an observation. The meaning of what is perceived should at least be that of a universal, not a sensuous this. In other words, science searches for the universal, for laws, but the natural world is an infinity of particulars, of facts, that tree over there. Thus, Hegel argues, the task of science is infinite. This restless, unceasing instinct, he says, can never run out of material. For Hegel, as for Kant, modern natural science proceed and must proceed by progressively more conceptual versions of nature, and there is nothing in nature that will stop this. An example Hegel gives should be familiar to our seniors, and I say should. 251. Because at the same time, the law is in itself the concept, the instinct of reason, of this consciousness, necessarily sets itself to purifying the law in its moments into concepts, but without knowing that this is what it wants to do. And it thus sets up experiments about the law. For example, this is the part the seniors should know. Negative electricity more or less first makes itself known as resin electricity, just as positive electricity more or less first makes itself known as glass electricity. By way of experiment, Versuche, both entirely lose this significance and become purely positive and negative electricity, neither of which is any longer bound up with things of a particular kind. Hegel's use of the term experiment, Versuche, literally attempt, and derived from suchen, to search, reminds us that modern science does not proceed by mere observation or gathering data, but by experiments, sometimes revealingly called controlled experiments, observations that are designed to answer a pointed question we are putting to nature. From a perspective that is purely scientific, that is to say purely observational, the status of what these experiments show is not entirely clear to the experimenters. On the one hand, they suppose they are discovering laws of nature that are somehow out there and not a product of their own minds. And that's, now I go to paragraph 250 on the handout, section A. This is Hegel. That the truth of law is essentially reality becomes for the consciousness which sticks to observation once again an opposition to the concept and to the universal in itself, or in its eyes, such a thing as its law is not an essence that stems from reason. In that law, it supposes that it has received something alien. That view, however, cannot stand. Hegel goes on, this is section B. Yet it refutes its own supposition in its act of taking its universality not to mean that all singular sensuous things must have provided evidence for the appearance of law in order for it to be able to assert the truth of the law. The assertion that if you pick up a stone off the ground and drop it, then it falls, does not at all require that the experiment to have been made with all stones. Consciousness thus has an experience the existence of the law, but it likewise has it there as a concept, and only on account of both circumstances together is the law true in its own eyes. The law counts as law because it exhibits itself in appearance and at the same time is in itself the concept. At this point, a very reasonable objection to Hegel's critique of observing reason might be made. So what? That is to say, so what if the scientists can't quite settle on what it is they're doing? Is it discovery or invention, fact or concept, or why they're doing it? Just let them do it, especially since scientific knowledge seems the only kind of knowledge of nature that is available, and it produces so many nice gadgets like iPhones. It is very tempting to just stay at the observing reason stage and go no further, putting a going out of business sale on the door of philosophy. Many of our modern research universities are close to doing such, even if via inertia, lip service continues to be paid to the humanities. But to give into that temptation would be to be content with living in an unreflective condition. It would be to content oneself with living in a cave, or perhaps, given the difficulty of finding an exit, a cave beneath the cave. The key point, for Hegel, modern science, observing reason's inability to understand itself is only part of a deeper limitation, namely its constitutional inability to understand what, or rather who, since man is not just a what or object, man is. Reason's self-knowledge will require something more than controlled experiments such as those done by psychologists. The oscillation of observing reason between concept and fact, between idealism and empiricism, is for Hegel just the first sign of a deeper, more massive problem. Observing reason is in the grip of instinct because reason has, as I've already mentioned, an inherent desire, namely a desire to grasp itself. Hegel says, and this is paragraph 242 in the handout, consciousness observes. Reason wants to find itself and to have itself as an existent object, as an actual, sensually present mode. Observing consciousness supposes and even says that it wants to learn from experience not about itself, but rather about the essence of things as things. Reason, as it immediately comes on the scene as consciousness' certainty of being all reality, grasps its reality in the sense of the immediacy of being. However, its actual activity contradicts this supposition, for it knows things and transforms their sensuousness into concepts, precisely into a being which is at the same time the I. So what does it mean that reason, quote, wants to find itself as an object, as an actual sensually present mode, unquote? What is observing reason via its instinct in its restless motion trying to grasp? What it can't seem to get a hold of, to comprehend in the way a monkey's prehensile tail grasps a branch, is reason's own free concept-making activity. This instinctive searching after itself is the basis of the plot line of the whole long observing reason section. In Hegel's presentation, the modern scientific consciousness starts its journey as a physicist. And isn't mathematical physics the ultimate foundation of the rest of modern science? Chemistry resting on physics, biology on chemistry. As a physicist, it looks for laws, or as we might say, formulae. However, this hypothetical reflective consciousness, who is the protagonist of the phenomenology, who is continually being educated through experience, senses instinctively that the deterministic billiard ball world of physics, of masses, forces, and velocities, does not seem to have room in it for something as free or self-determining and hence reflective as thought. Via that dissatisfaction, the observing reasoner, who is Hegel's character, leaves physics and becomes a biologist, looking to the organized and purposive activity of living things, of animals which are self-moving wholes that change while remaining themselves, as the royal road to wisdom. For Hegel, life, which Hegel calls the organic, is somehow more congruent than non-life to the free nature of thought, which stays the same, in other words, stays my thought, even as its content changes. However, biology, too, for reasons which unfortunately I must summarize very superficially, proves not to be the answer, the organic world being not a sufficient means by which observing reason can, quote, find itself as a sensuous object. Hegel's argument, as I understand it, boils down to this. It's all very well to insist, one thinks of Hans Jonas, that living things are not machines, but self-moving wholes. However, can a new insistence on wholeness, a neo-teleology, as it were, really change the content of the science of biology, which, like other natural sciences, proceeds by resolving wholes into parts, such as DNA? Hegel argues that all insistence on the purposive unity of living beings is something added on to natural science, not changing the deepest tendencies of science. Because, he follows Kant here, purposiveness is not something reason can observe. Organisms and a reflection about them lead us to think the organism and its organs function as if they are governed by purposes, by a deliberate design. However, as Hegel says, any purpose has to be referred to, quote, another intelligence, i.e., to God, because the existence of a design or designer is in principle unknowable and as such excluded from science. Knowledge of nature as an object, in other words, as something that is not us, is still limited to laws, to mute inorganic truths like H2O. Biology, then, just as physics fails in its bid to be the master science, the architechne, other failures, albeit constructive failures, follow. Much like a confused undergraduate trying to choose a major, Mr. and Ms. Observing Reasoner, in its instinctive self-seeking, goes through many other sciences, none of which quite fit the self-knowledge bill. To make a long story short, I will, as they say in Hollywood, cut to the chase. The last stop on Observing Reason's odyssey, before Mr. Miss Consciousness jumps the observation ship altogether and tries something more active, is phrenology. That long-forgotten and much ridiculed science, quote, of understanding someone's psyche by interpreting the bumps on their skull. At the end of the Observing Reason section, Hegel presents phrenology as the reductio ad absurdum of Observing Reason's implicit claim that it knows, or in principle can know, all of reality, or rather what is essential about reality. How did we get here? Considering the movement of the Observing Reason section as a whole, the devolving of Observing Reason into phrenology makes a certain crazy sense. In Hegel's dialectic, 3 is the magic number. The first, very long part of Observing Reason, that's little a and big A, is observing nature, where, in effect, the self is trying to find itself in an object, in German Gegenstande, standing against. In other words, something outside and standing against the self. When Hegel speaks of the natural consciousness, what he means is that objectification, getting a correct picture or representation, Vorstellung, of reality is always the first place the self or subject wants to go. Not finding itself outside itself, Observing Reason, reasonably enough, turns back on itself, trying to find in logic and psychology, that's little section B of big section A of chapter 5, a science of the subjective. But this inward turn is not sufficient. The fact that there are 2 sciences of the subject, of the self, namely logic and psychology, is indicative of the problem. There are 2 different kinds of laws. And remember, science, understood as observing reason, is the search for law. 2 different kinds of laws that thought follows, but of different orders, emotional and rational. The self has fallen apart once again. And moreover, isn't the subjective just as much of an abstraction as the objective? What observing reason really wants, in the end, is a science that is objective and subjective at the same time. And that's Roman numeral 5, big letter A, little letter C. So phrenology makes its appearance. It is one of the phenomena that the phenomenology describes, because its promise fits the bill. Here's Hegel, section 334. If a conscious mode of spirit has its feeling in a determinate place on the skull, then perhaps this place on the skull will indicate by its shape that mode of spirit and its particularity. For example, when engaged in strenuous thought, some people complain of feeling a painful tension somewhere in the head. And sometimes they complain even when they're thinking at all. Likewise, I know that feeling. Likewise, stealing, committing murder, writing poetry, and so forth might each be accompanied by its own proper feeling, which moreover would have to be its own particular location as well. This location of the brain, which in this manner would be more in motion and be more activated, would most likely also even further develop the neighboring location of the bone. These are all Hegel's italics, by the way. Now, the idea that one could know a person by the bumps on his head is pretty funny. And we laugh when we see those old maps of the skull used by phrenologists. But this physical approach to the psyche and the relevance of Hegel's critique of it has not gone away. Far from it. The phrase location in the brain should ring a bell, Pavlovian or otherwise. Neurophysiology and the related discipline of psychopharmacology are among the hottest things going, the holy grail of modern science, and precisely for the reason that Hegel indicates. The promise of a final, complete self-knowledge is, now as always, the telos, the goal. Could self-knowledge be achieved in a purely scientific way? That is to say, could the psyche be understood objectively in both senses of that term, as an object, which we stand over and observe, and as an understanding that is impartial, not colored by a particular observer's own biases and interests? If some of what Hegel says on the subject is very dated, other arguments of his, especially if one has a little imagination and construes and develops these arguments in a charitable way, have a contemporary resonance which is almost eerie. But perhaps it is better to take a contemporary example, which I found in 15 seconds on Google, with the search terms psychopath brain abnormality. I have the web address for anybody who's interested. In a recent study done at King's College London, it was shown that among a population of violent criminals, the ones showing a truly psychopathic lack of empathy, as opposed to being just really angry when they did their crime, quote, displayed significantly reduced gray matter volumes in the anterior rostral prefrontal cortex and temporal poles, unquote. Well, it's hard to argue with science. But such a study raises all sorts of questions, such as whether all people who have such a reduced amount of critical gray matter lack empathy, or whether all those who are psychopaths lack gray matter. Hegel warns that any physical view of the self suffers from this kind of uncertainty, as far as being able to predict what a real individual will do, think, or feel, and thus it must engage in making its claims in subterfuge, is the word Hegel uses, or equivocation. That is to say, observing reason has to argue both that the outer or behavior expresses the inner physical reality, and at the same time, it has to argue that said inner physical reality might never be expressed because it only causes a disposition, see 338 on the handout. What the view of self as brain leaves out paradoxically, and grasping how these fit together is necessary to grasp Hegel's thought, what it leaves out is both the freedom of the self and its determination by the individual circumstances of its historical development. For Hegel, the equivocation of speaking of dispositions or tendencies points to the deepest problem of observing reason, namely its constitutional inability to grasp what spirit is, hence what it is. In our day, with MRIs, we have a pretty good idea. We've become pretty good at figuring out which part of the brain lights up when we think or feel something. Does this explain what thought is? Objections to the idea that neuroscience could explain thinking are usually met with, but the science is still in its infancy. But nevertheless, it is worth asking now, maybe before we forget how to ask and become completely enraptured by science fiction fantasies such as the willful computer Hal in the movie 2001. Such questions as, would a complete neural map of the brain, assuming such a thing were possible, be any help in distinguishing a good argument from a bad argument? Would such a map tell us why we do science or what science knows? Could any purely physical reading of someone's brain, as opposed to speaking with them, tell us what language they spoke or what views of the world they had or of themselves, let alone whether such views were reasonable? Could a computer genuinely, i.e. spontaneously, without being programmed to do so, worry that it was just a computer and write the critique of pure computation? Hegel's answers to all these questions would, of course, be no. And I think he helps us understand why we should not worship neuroscience as the final solution of the consciousness problem. Hegel preserves the importance of the human. Science is human activity, an activity of spirit, and spirit is not, Hegel claims, any kind of being or thing. To those who would assert otherwise, reducing what is high, spirit, to what is low, mere matter, Hegel is rather cutting, even crude, in effect responding in kind. And this is section 346. The depth from which spirit pushes out from its inwardness, but which it manages to push up only to the level of representational consciousness about what it says, are the same kind of connection of higher and lower which, in the case of the living being, nature itself naively expresses in the combination of the organ of its highest fulfillment, the organ of generation, with the organ of urination. The infinite judgment as infinite would be the fulfillment of self-comprehending life, whereas the consciousness of the infinite judgment, which remains trapped within representational thought, conducts itself like urination. This is strident rhetoric. Strident, I think, because Hegel judges, correctly in my view, that the contemporary worship of science, which is already true in his time, facilitated and abetted by the self-confidence of the scientists, is the most recalcitrant because the least obvious obstacle to education in the fullest sense. Nevertheless, Hegel is not anti-science, reactionary, or willfully ignorant. The goal of the observing reason section of the Phenomenology is to put science in perspective, something science cannot do any for itself any more than one can edit one's own writing. But reason, including but not limited to science or observing reason, can only be seen critically as a whole from the larger perspective of spirit. Second section, much shorter than the first section. From observing reason to spirit. Rather than being a thing, spirit is activity, self-moving activity. For Hegel, spirit's non-thing-like character can only be fully seen when we see that spirit is social and historical all the way down. As such, it cannot be just an individual like Descartes' cogito, or simply constituted by the workings of physical and chemical processes. Now, Hegel had prepared the ground for the understanding of spirit as social and historical, relational and time-bound early in the Phenomenology, in chapter 4, self-consciousness. Hegel claims in chapter 4 that self-consciousness exists only for another self-consciousness. Following the path opened up by Rousseau's analysis of amour-propre and the discourse on inequality, Hegel argues that being a self, i.e. self-conscious that it is a self, requires at a minimum a recognition of my selfhood, that I am not a thing but free, on the part of another self recognized as such by me. I'll say that a few times to make sense of it. This claim about the inherently relational character of self-consciousness is the necessary but not the sufficient basis for the claim that consciousness is spirit. Even the long observing reason section does no more than argue that the mind is not a thing, an object that can be observed. There is still much of the reason chapter left and much work to do in demolishing all conceivable claims on the part of the individual to be self-sufficient. Immediately following observing reason's comeuppance, the next phenomenon to appear in chapter 5 is Goethe's character Faust, who rejects the life of the mind in favor of experience, indeed in favor of pleasure. Given that modern science has none of the answers to life's big questions, consciousness has now, and these are paragraphs 360 and 361 on the handout, consciousness with Faust is now, quote, left behind the law of custom and existence, the knowledge acquired through observation and theory, as a gray shadow which is in the act of passing out of sight. It plunges therefore into life and indulges to the full the pure individuality in which it appears. Hegel thus finds Faust's rejection of science and even morality almost reasonable and certainly understandable. But this path too, even though it has put the last nail in the coffin of detached observation, is a dead end, self-contradictory. I'm getting close to the end, so I must move rapidly. Be assured. The reason chapter ends with taking up the claim of Kant's pure practical reason. That is, the claim that reason can on its own, independent of the facts of human nature, psychology, or history, give itself laws, that is, come up with timeless and universal moral principles or oughts. Hegel argues that this, reason's last stand as it were, cannot work because reason's pure formalism, familiar to us in Kant's categorical imperative, will fail to give itself content. The movement at the end of the Reason chapter parallels the movement in the lectures on the philosophy of right from morality to the ethical world. However, and this is the important part, just before the concluding sections on law giving reason and reason as testing laws, there is a section which is capital to understanding why the next place Mr. Misconsciousness will go after finishing up with reason is spirit. This section has the very strange title, The Spiritual Animal Kingdom and Deception, or The Thing That Matters. Die geistige Tierreich und der Betrug oder die Sache selbst. That helps. Its subject matter is that strange modern species, the intellectual. Tier is not only animal, but beast, wild. Das Tier im Menschen is the beast in man. It's as if we were now in the Wizard of Oz, going with Dorothy through the dark forest, chanting critics and writers and artists, oh my. Just who are these spiritual beasts? And what's beastly and spiritual about them? The selves in the spiritual animal kingdom, unlike the observing reasoners, do not claim that they have an objective science of everything. They are, one might say, too sophisticated for such a claim. That kind of confidence is just so last century. Besides, every form of self, after observing reason has been left behind, has an element of action, self-realization, rather than just being a point of view. What the spiritual animals have is not the truth. That naive word embarrasses them. What they have is their work, which they feel compelled to do because it realizes their nature, their own individual nature. One sees this in the etymological connection between genius and generation. This form of self allows, one might say, more individuality than the previous forms of self. True painters feel compelled to paint, musicians to compose, physicists to make equations. They all have their work, the thing that matters. Die Sache selbst, literally the matter itself, matter understood in the sense of subject matter. Sounds great. Almost like one of those idyllic pictures by the artist known as Le Douanier Rousseau, where all the animals, even sheep and lions, are sitting there calmly together. But there is a nagging question about the thing that matters. Matters to whom? The artist, a writer, a physicist might say, what matters is that I am satisfied with my work. Who cares if anyone sees it or thinks it beautiful or important or good or true? However, anybody who knows one such soul knows that such an answer is an exercise in self-deception. It's just not that simple. The production of a work is a production of something that is available to others, hence to their criteria. The producer, and for Hegel that includes every form of intellectual life, including his own, must care about the reception of their work. This is not a psychological fact, the consequence of human vanity, but an inherent consequence of intellectual production. You have to convince someone else that what you say or make is beautiful or important or good or true. Otherwise, you might just be crazy. An idiot in the original Greek sense, meaning private or particular, idios, living in your own private Idaho, like a wild potato. This dependence on others, on their appreciation and criticism, is as much animal as it is spiritual. It's not just that in the world of the intellect there is now a competition, a near Darwinian struggle, as it were, for prominence and influence. There is also a kind of feeding that takes place. Are you the best judge of your own work? Of its significance? Maybe not. So you write a novel. I read it. Perhaps I see its importance more clearly than you did. And even write another novel that takes advantage of the artistic possibilities that you opened up. I'll put you in the acknowledgments. I've digested you and moved on. What's worse, that you will write something that no one will see, or that you will write something that others will appreciate better than you did and transform it? As a spiritual animal, you must express yourself, but once your work is out there, you no longer have control of it, and it is no longer you. What Hegel says in the section on the spiritual animal kingdom constitutes, in my view, his strongest argument that all thought is spirit. Or as he puts it, an I that is a we that is an I. We are individuals who are social all the way down, and vice versa. I do not know whether this vision and its consequence, that philosophy can be nothing more than the highest self-consciousness of its time, is true. What I am fairly confident of, philosophy must be that at the very least. That is to say, liberal education as liberating education must pose the question of spirit. What time is it? I'm almost done. Why spirit is the natural cave? I say why Greece is the natural cave. Very short section. The spirit chapter of the Phenomenology opens up with a discussion of Greece. It then proceeds to a discussion of Sophocles' play Antigone, where two all-important and related questions are raised. Where does the human being's most fundamental allegiance and identity lie? In the family or in his or her political community? And two, where does law come from, the gods or man? These divides are divides in the Greek world itself and will, once their consequences are played out, bring the humans out of the Greek polis and into a very different order of spirit, namely Roman law. Hegel calls Greek spirit true spirit, and the dialectical ascent in the Phenomenology from here on in follows the actual chronological order of human history. But it has taken a lot of work, 5 long chapters, more than half the book, to get to this initial or immediate form of spirit. In particular, we had to claw our way out of the various modern positions of chapter 5 just to get to Greece. But why start here? Why is Greece Hegel's example of true spirit? Aren't there, even in Hegel's own work, many other, and assuming time even matters, earlier versions of spirit? China, India, Persia, Israel, Egypt, just to name a few from his lectures on the philosophy of world history. And to make even matters even more complicated, even chapter 7 of the Phenomenology, religion, which is in Hegel's presentation the subjective side of world spirit, starts not with Greece but with Egypt. What is so important about Greece? I think an important clue is found in something Hegel says about Egypt, and in particular about the Sphinx, in the lectures on the philosophy of world history. Here, and in the religion chapter of the Phenomenology, Hegel presents Egypt as the immediate predecessor, in a way the source of the Greek spirit. In the Sphinx, in that riddling being slain by Oedipus, the Egyptians came up with an image of the central riddle of human existence, even if, as Hegel claims, they did not themselves understand the question, or even that it was a question. The Sphinx, Hegel argues, must be understood not statically, in an Egyptian way, but dynamically. It is the human bursting out of the animal, freedom emerging from its submergence in nature. This capacity to burst forth is the ground of the historicity, the development of human thought and society. The Sphinx, in short, is an image of spirit, of the incarnation of spirit in the world. But this combination of nature and freedom, this joining of Kant's third antinomy, never ceases to be a riddle. Man both is and is not the maker of himself. That, Oedipus discovers, is a problem. The Greeks are important, and I think will always be important, because they bring this problem into the open with a force, with a clarity, with a radicality that, as far as I'm aware, has no equal. Bringing the riddle of who man is to the surface, Hegel claims, is not just the work of Sophocles or Plato or any small group of thinkers. This motion is implicit in the history of the Greek polis itself. Democracy, however imperfect or limited, has within it an implicit claim of human agency, self-determination, a claim that is always coming up against limits. But this motion and the questions and questioners which this motion bring to the surface rend the Greek world asunder. The antinomy between Creon and Antigone becomes the opposition between Socrates and Aristophanes. Hegel, one might say, takes the Olympian view. He does not take sides. He makes us see that Western civilization has been in crisis from the beginning, or even that crisis, a cutting, is the very soul of the West. For this reason, the Greeks are the right place to begin to philosophize about the human things. Their world is, as one might say, the natural cave. We need to return to them both with and without Hegel, if we would open up philosophical questions that perhaps have been prematurely closed, as well as paradoxically, to better understand where we are today. Conclusion. Finally, why is Hegel important? Hegel's thought is an attempt to think through, to deepen the Enlightenment, to raise it from Voltairean fad to a fully reflective self-awareness. Despite the passage of time and the monstrous difficulty of his writings, I think I can think of few better guides to our own self-examination than Hegel. He makes us aware, as few thinkers do, of all the forest of claims and counterclaims. Moreover, and I think this is perhaps more important today than ever, Hegel reminds us of the mystery, and I think this mystery is at the center of the liberal arts, of how we are all a combination of spirit and animal, historical and natural, freedom and necessity, word made flesh. Thank you.